This is 2020. Tonight, remember this? Gander, Newfoundland. 248 U.S. soldiers killed in an air tragedy. Shattered families consoled by the president.
Tragedy is nothing new to mankind, but somehow it's always a surprise.
The official ruling, an accident. But was it, or did terrorists cause the worst air disaster in military history that no one survived? Then, in a major 2020 investigation, Lynn Scher re-examines the case. What caused the crash?
One report says it was ice, but yet there's no proof that it was ice. It's just all theory.
Were witnesses brushed off? Was evidence ignored?
The hole blown through the fuselage strongly suggests that an explosion took place on board the airplane while it was still in flight.
And the theory that could rock the nation.
Do you really believe that Iran-Contra figures in that air crash?
I think there's a strong possibility, and I think we need answers to these questions.
The tragedy at Gander. What really happened? Plus, a ballplayer's dream that came crashing down. 1986, California Angels pitcher Donnie Moore. One strike away from the World Series. Instead, a home run pitch.
He goes back, and it's gone! Unbelievable!
A broken career. And this summer,
when they said a California Angel had killed himself, I knew who it was.
Tonight, Dick Schaap on what some call the fatal pitch of Donnie Moore.
Who can forget 2 weeks before Christmas, 1985? 248 American soldiers killed when their chartered plane went down in Gander, Newfoundland.
We all grieved with them and for them, the families of those young men and women. But now some of those same families feel that they have been betrayed.
They do. They feel they've been lied to and toyed with. Some even feel that the official findings of what caused the crash should be stamped cover-up.
For the past 5 months, 2020 has been investigating and reviewed thousands of documents, talked to eyewitnesses, and uncovered new evidence. It's a two-part report. Lynn Scher has our investigation and takes us back to a December afternoon when these scenes and this sound told the story of the season.
On December 16, 1985, the bodies began to arrive in the United States. In all, there would be 256. For a military funeral, this one seemed sadder, more senseless than most. These servicemen and women died not in battle, but in an airplane, in the worst aviation accident in military history. The plane had been chartered from Arrow Air. A DC-8, like this one, filled to capacity with cargo, 8 crew, and 248 members of an elite battalion of the 101st Airborne. After 6 months on an unpopular peacekeeping mission in the Sinai, the soldiers, mostly young men and women in their 20s, were headed home for the holidays, a route that had brought them from Cairo to Cologne to Gander, Newfoundland for refueling. At 6:45 a.m., the plane took off from Gander.
950 Gander Tower, favor takeoff on 22, winds will come.
Less than a minute later, it crashed to the earth.
Tower 351, should have an explosion off here to the west.
There were no survivors. The flames would burn for 23 hours. The official investigation took 3.5 years, hampered greatly by the immense destruction that had left only half the plane remaining. The Islamic Jihad had immediately claimed responsibility, and some who were there said the plane was on fire before it crashed. But any hint of terrorism was immediately dismissed by both the Canadian and the United States governments.
I don't think that that terrorism in this particular case is involved.
In the end, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, the CASB, which has jurisdiction, announced its official conclusion. Icing on the wings was the probable cause of the accident. But that conclusion was not accepted by everyone. Nearly half the Canadian board disagreed, issuing their own minority report. saying the probable cause was an onboard fire that may have been caused by an explosion. Was it icing or an explosion? The controversy led us to re-examine the facts in this now closed case. And we have uncovered new evidence that lends further support to the possibility of an onboard explosion. Evidence that may make you wonder what really happened to the Arrow Air charter. About the only fact not in dispute is that the plane crashed here, just short of Gander Lake. Gander, Newfoundland, in the northeast corner of Canada, is a tiny town. But its location at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean has made it a major refueling stop for the world's aircraft. And because Gander Airport employs so many people here, many residents either serviced the Arrow charter before it took off, watched its brief flight, or helped clean up here at the crash site. And what they saw before, during, and after the crash differs radically from the official conclusions of a 3-year investigation. Teddy West was part of the ground crew who serviced the plane during its 1-hour refueling stop at Gander.
I didn't see any ice on the airplane. I still don't think there was any ice on the airplane, and that's the way I want to keep my story.
When you talked to the CASB investigators, what did they want to know?
He asked me if I had seen any ice on the airplane, anywhere at all on the airplane, and I told him no. I hadn't noticed any ice whatsoever. And I was close enough that I had to have my hand on the airplane, and I didn't feel any ice.
Minutes after Teddy West had his hand on the plane, the DC-8 taxied down the runway for takeoff. Judy Parsons, a rental car agent, was just arriving at work.
It was really dark, and I heard it take off, and the sky just lit up. And as I faced it, it was like streaks, a gray, bluey streaks, and as they faded out, this bright orange object came out of it, and it proceeded through the sky for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then just blew up.
What did you think that object was?
At the time, it all happened so fast, I didn't know what it was, and then all of a sudden it hit me, that's a plane.
When the CASB came to investigate, did they talk to you?
Yes, they did. I told them exactly what I told you. I told the Canadian Safety Board the same thing.
As the plane struggled to gain altitude, it crossed the Trans-Canada Highway here at the end of the runway. By now, it was out of Judy Parsons' sight, but because it was only about 60 feet high, it was in plain view of a number of truck drivers and their passengers going by. Those eyewitnesses said they saw a red or orange glow, like a fire, on the right side of the fuselage. 5 seconds later, the plane crashed. At least 3 truck drivers told the CASB strikingly similar stories. My first impression of the glow was that it was a fire. When I first saw the glow, it appeared the airplane was dropping. It could have been the right engines of the plane that were afire. In addition to the eyewitnesses, several investigators turned up evidence pointing to similar conclusions. Irving Pinkel is an investigator for Arrow Air's insurance company.
Said that I found a section of airplane fuselage that had a hole blown through it.
Pinkel, who spoke to 2020 with the permission of attorneys, wrote a report for the insurance company.
The report states simply that the hole blown through the fuselage strongly suggests that an explosion took place on board the airplane while it was still in flight. It doesn't say anything about bombs. This is the hole I found. It measures perhaps 10 inches to a foot this way by another foot this way. All it tells me is that it's a witness mark to the fact that it was an explosion on board, and this is the only evidence I see of that explosion. This is hard evidence. I take it from the airplane. The icing is derived evidence. I'd say they overlooked what I consider important information. How much other important information did they overlook of that kind?
Pinkel's findings have been dismissed by the official report. But 2020 has uncovered new evidence supporting an onboard fire, possibly caused by an explosion. Evidence we found across the Atlantic from the crash site in London, England. Dr. Richard Shepherd, a forensic pathologist at London's Guy's Hospital, was asked by lawyers for Arrow to review the pathology reports on the 256 victims. He was disturbed by what he read.
The findings that bothered me were there were a number of people with raised levels of two chemicals in their blood, carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. And these are chemicals that are produced in any fire, but are very common in fires involving polyurethane foams, the sort of foam you find in aircraft seats and in the other internal dressings of an aeroplane. These levels suggested to me that a lot of people had been alive when fires were burning.
Remember, the official conclusion says the plane crashed into the ground and then erupted into fire. That means victims would have inhaled fumes after impact. But Dr. Shepard says the victims he studied would not have survived the crash. Still, they show evidence of breathing during a fire.
I can identify a group of 14 people who have significantly raised levels of carbon monoxide and who I believe would not have survived the impact. That means that the fumes were inhaled before death. In this case, it means that the fumes of a fire were inhaled before the plane crashed.
Dr. Shepard's stunning conclusions have been presented to the Canadian board, to no avail. So there was evidence of an onboard fire or explosion, but it was all dismissed in the official conclusion in favor of icing. The minority members of the board, who believe an in-flight fire or explosion caused the crash, are furious at the way the investigation has been handled. Roger Lacroix, a former military pilot. Ross Stevenson, a former Air Canada pilot with 30,000 hours in flight. Les Filotas, an aeronautical engineer.
The ice theory is so bizarre, it's so convoluted, it's so outlandish, it's so in opposition to common sense and what the evidence is that somebody who seriously considered it can't possibly go along with it.
Does the majority report not prove it was ice?
No. On the contrary, it ignores very obvious evidence from excellent witnesses that this airplane was on fire and that this airplane did come apart. And there are witnesses that describe this airplane exploding in the air.
But they said investigators did not provide them with all the necessary evidence.
They would hide from the board facts that were absolutely essential for us to review and come up to a reasonable cause of this accident. I am certain that the board, the chairman, and the director of investigation acted illegally, prevented us from having access to all the information, lied to us, and withheld information, and sanitized the files.
For example, Judy Parsons. Remember her account of the plane that blew up? Well, even though she told investigators, that information was never passed on to the board at large.
Were you ever called and asked to testify?
Never.
Remember Teddy West, part of the ground service crew, who had his hand on the plane and felt no ice?
We just assumed that we would be one of the people that's called before the board.
And what happened?
We never did get called.
To the dissenting members of the board, it is very suspicious.
The Minister of Transport of Canada, Larry speaks on behalf of the administration, and a spokesman of the Pentagon, all come out while the fires are burning and nobody's investigated anything, and said there is no evidence of sabotage in this accident. But there was evidence of sabotage because they had received a call, and I don't care if it's from a press agency or from the Islam Jihad itself. There was a telephone call that stated that somebody was taking responsibility, and therefore it should have been taken seriously. In my view, the cover-up started at that time.
Cover-up. That's a voice from Canada. And now a U.S. congressman is pushing to reopen the investigation. When we come back, Lynn Scher raises new questions.
For example, there is a mystery about a last-minute cargo switch made before the plane left the Middle East. Plus these twists, a warning by Oliver North, and a possible link to the Iran arms deal. The tragedy at Gander, questions about what really happened right after this. Of the air disaster in Gander, Newfoundland, which killed 248 American soldiers. So far, we've focused on Canada's inquiry, some of its own board members ridiculing the theory that ice caused the crash, others saying that they were lied to and that key evidence was withheld. But what, if any, role has Washington played? In part 2 of her report, Lynn Scher tells us that there are those who feel a cover-up began almost as soon as the plane went down.
What caused the Arrow Air DC-8 to crash in Gander, Newfoundland in December 1985, killing all 248 soldiers and 8 crew members on board? Was it really icing on the wings, the official account? Or, as others have suggested, was there an onboard explosion before the plane crashed?
One report says it was ice, but yet there's no proof that it was ice. It's just all theory. And then I looked at the other report, and it talks about flames and fire and possible sabotage. Something just didn't ring right. I thought these are the same men that sat in the same room, that heard the same testimonies, saw the same evidence. How could they come up with two totally different things?
Zona Phillips and her husband Doug were at home in St. Petersburg, Florida, when they got the word that the plane had crashed, killing Doug's son, Doug Jr. Zona has founded a group now numbering more than 100 families called Families for the Truth About Gander, because she says she's been given the runaround by both the Canadian and the United States governments. The men who issued the minority report, doubting the icing theory, share her concern.
It boggles my mind that we went through it with such a shoddy process, and having done so and having tried to bring attention to it, nobody seems to think that this is a very serious matter.
For American families and some Canadian officials, there is an even greater frustration that the crash of a United States airplane killing 256 Americans is being investigated here entirely by the Canadian government. The United States government and the military don't seem to be pressing very hard for answers.
For instance, the FBI. Documents indicate the Bureau knew eyewitnesses had told of an explosion and that the Islamic Jihad had claimed responsibility. First, as this internal memo indicates, the FBI said there was absolutely no indication of terrorism or sabotage. So why, less than 60 days after the crash, was an FBI agent asking questions about explosives? The name of the man they were interviewing was blacked out on this document, obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. But 2020 learned it was Stephen Saunders, a former Arrow Air pilot who had previously flown the jet that went down. Here's what Captain Saunders was asked by the FBI agent.
He made reference to a quantity of C4 plastic explosive, roughly about 1/4 to 1/2 a pound, and also in reference to what we would refer to as a Mark I type pineapple hand grenade. He said if an explosive had been detonated in a DC-8 aircraft, what persons in what seat rows would be most likely to receive some type of projectile penetration from the seat bottom?
As for the U.S. Army, whose soldiers were killed in the crash, they claim to have painstakingly searched the crash site. So why did a 2-star general, Major General John S. Crosby, who was on the scene, ask on the day after the crash that the rubble be plowed under? The Army says Crosby was worried about souvenir hunters. And what does the Army know about the mystery cargo? 6 coffin-sized boxes loaded on board at the last minute in Cairo. They were important enough that some 40 soldiers' duffel bags were removed to make room, but the boxes were never listed on the manifest. This aerial photo of the crash scene that we blew up seems to show the kind of boxes described, right where firemen said they saw them. But the Army denies reports that a military plane spirited them away, or that the boxes contained weapons. They say the boxes belong to Arrow. In fact, the Army says the Canadian report was thorough and competent. Not one shred of evidence supports a terrorist attack.
You know, it's ludicrous to me. And I mean, you look on the marginalia of the FBI reports and you see where the CIA was in there and the DIA and all these other agencies. You know, and all the time you're going tick, 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 you know, what's going on here? Nobody knows anything, but everybody was in it. Very strange.
We spoke to all the U.S. government agencies involved in the investigation, but none would agree to talk to us on camera for this report. The National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, told us they accept the Canadian board's conclusion of icing. The Army told us it wasn't their job to investigate. They rely on the NTSB. And the FBI said they had nothing new to add. They only helped out at the request of the Canadians.
I firmly believe that it's all tied into the Iran-Contra and arms for hostages bit, because all that was coming down at that period in time.
It was a very sensitive time around December the 12th, 1985.
Congressman Robin Talon was contacted earlier this year by two families from a South Carolina district who had lost relatives in the crash. After months of investigation, he has now taken up their cause and shares their suspicions.
When I first heard people talk about the Iran-Contra connection, it sounded quite fantastic. Do you really believe that Iran-Contra figures in that air crash?
Well, I think there's a strong possibility, and I think we need answers to these questions. And
it may sound fantastic, but here's what they think happened. In 1985, the U.S. government set up a secret operation to supply arms to the Contras in Central America and to sell weapons to Iran, all in an effort to free Americans then held hostage. As this deposition shows, Arrow Air was used to transport some of the arms. As revealed by the Tower Commission, in December of 1985, the Reagan administration decided to stop selling arms to Iran and told them so at a meeting in London. At about the same time, the Iranians discovered that they'd received the wrong weapons in one shipment. The next day, when Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was running the operation, returned to Washington, he wrote a top-secret memo in which he warned that the Iranians were so angry over the shipments being stopped, their reaction could ignite fire. Hostages would be our minimum loss. That memo came 3 days before the Arrow Air crash.
There could have been arms that were being brought back to the United States that possibly exploded on that plane to cause it to crash.
Arms that had been intended for Iran?
Had been intended for Iran, but as has been documented, this was an incredible $2 billion arms deal. People involved over in the White House were warned that there were going to be reprisals. It could have been sabotage, some sort of bomb placed on the plane.
You talked about the possibility of a cover-up. Do you believe there has been a cover-up?
Well, there's strong circumstantial evidence. I think it would have been an absolute catastrophic problem for Ronald Reagan into his second term, about a year and a half, had he been faced with the American public finding out first at that time that we just botched an arms for hostage deal that nobody would have been in favor of, that deal could have possibly cost the lives of 248 American service personnel. I think he would have been faced with impeachment.
Congressman Talon's outrage over the way the issue has been handled was intensified by the answer he got to questions about those mysterious 6 boxes on board. Talon wonders if the boxes contained weapons, or even possibly bodies.
This is a letter to you from the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, in which they say regarding those boxes that it was approximately 1,300 pounds of aircraft equipment and spare parts which air carriers routinely carry. You're saying that's a lie?
Yes, I'm saying that's a lie. I'm saying that they said that the material belonged to Arrow Air, and now Arrow Air says no, the material did not belong to us.
You're making a very strong case for terrorism, but in this letter from the Defense Department, they say, quote, there is no credible evidence to support the allegation that this crash resulted from terrorist or criminal action.
Well, I'm at the point now, I have been lied to, I have been led around, I have been misled, and I'm trying to represent the families in this situation. The burden of proof is not on the families, the burden of proof is on the United States government, and they have failed to provide answers that should be provided.
But K.J. Thornycroft, a former pilot and chairman of the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, says the official report answers all the questions. He defends the 3.5-year investigation.
can only say that there's no evidence to support an in-flight explosion. None at all.
But what about the eyewitnesses? The ones who said there was no ice, only an in-flight explosion. Judy Parsons, Teddy West, the truck drivers.
When Mrs. Parsons talked to us, she was very specific about what she saw.
Well, you'll have to forgive me if I don't agree with Mrs. Parsons. After all, it's almost 3.5 years since the incident, and her written testimony and what she's saying today don't necessarily jibe in every case.
Quite the contrary. When I interviewed her and then read what she had said in her first interview after the crash, they were exactly the same.
I see. Okay.
Why wasn't she called to testify?
We have taken evidence from some 300 witnesses, 200 or 300 witnesses. Obviously, we can't call them all to appear at the public hearing. So let's have a roundtable discussion, decide what evidence we want to have come out at the public hearing, and then select a group of witnesses who will provide that evidence.
None of the witnesses who saw no ice were included.
I don't think that's necessarily correct. Now, it is a fact that human eyewitness evidence is unfortunately the most unreliable form of evidence you can have.
But wasn't one eyewitness included who did see ice?
Just that one.
Why was one person who said there was ice included where 5 or 6 who said there was no ice were not included?
That's a good question. I can't answer that. I don't know.
Would you admit that it looks a little strange?
Well, it probably does look a little strange if you look at it in that respect, but I don't think that necessarily that's the case. That's a good point.
And what about the medical evidence? Lethal levels of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide in victims' bodies, indicating they breathed fumes of a fire before the crash.
It's also possible, unfortunately, that the same could occur if people are technically still alive following a crash to have it introduced. And we believe that to be the case in this particular instance.
People who had been decapitated and all their limbs severed or technically still alive?
That seemed like an anomaly, and it is, but there is a reasoned school of thought thinking that open cavities can, in fact, take on that type of toxic material.
The dissenters claim there has been a cover-up in this case. Has there been a cover-up?
I don't think so. In order to have a cover-up, you'd have to implicate the National Transportation Safety Board, FAA, the American Army, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the government of the United States, the government of Canada. How could you possibly cover up something with all those players?
Why are there so many outstanding questions, both from the experts and from the family members? Doesn't this bother you at all?
For sure it bothers me.
So why not have a new investigation and clear it up?
I'd be the first to stand in line if I thought that we could add to what we already have. We can.
A cynic might say that you eliminated everything from the report that didn't jibe with the icing theory.
I understand cynics saying that, but I deny that that's what we did at all.
But that explanation is not acceptable to everyone, particularly to the families, like Doug and Zona Phillips, who say they won't give up until they found the truth.
I'm doing it for Doug. We're doing it for ourselves, for peace of mind, but mostly and primarily, we're doing it for other people, and we feel like we're doing it for our country. Because at this point in time, I feel that we have been betrayed by the country that we love so deeply.
Lynn, as far as Canada is concerned, is this case closed now?
The case is closed. There have been several official investigations into the investigation, but none of them has indicated any reason to reopen it.
Well, now, a lot of people now see this as a cover-up. Is there any real evidence that President Reagan was involved in such, if it is a cover-up?
No, there is absolutely no evidence of that. But, you know, I asked that question to Congressman Talon, and he said, even though there was no evidence, his point is that when 256 Americans and an American plane are lost, it seems suspicious to him that it's entirely left up to Canadian investigators.
What's Congressman Talon's strategy from this point?
He is now enlisting the aid of other members of Congress whose constituents include relatives of the victims, trying to get them to join with him to petition President Bush. He wants the president to spearhead an effort to look into this, to reopen the investigation. At the very least, what he wants is a congressional investigation.